He thought coming home for a short leave would finally quiet the restless feeling he had carried for years. Evan Parker, a Navy SEAL, returned to San Diego with his K-9 partner Bruno, believing this night would be simple. But just a mile from home, Bruno suddenly stopped. A low growl, a sharp pull toward a dark alley, and in the shadows, someone was there. Frail, barely breathing, forgotten by the world. Evan stepped closer, and in that moment, something deeper than instinct stirred. Because what Bruno had found that night wasn't just a stranger. It was the beginning of a buried truth, and a secret someone had tried very hard to erase. Before we begin, share the city you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if this kind of story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe and be part of the journey. Now, let's get into it. A cool June night settled over San Diego, the air carrying a thin layer of mist that softened the city lights into a quiet glow. Inside the taxi, Evan Parker leaned back, but only just enough to look at ease. There was always something held beneath the surface, like a current that never fully stilled. Discipline had carved that into him over the years, turning stillness into control rather than rest. He watched the city slide past without moving much, as if his awareness stretched further than his body needed to. Beside him, the dog sat in quiet alertness. No movement wasted, no sound made, yet nothing slipped past him. If Evan carried control, the animal carried instinct, silent, steady, and tuned to things the human world often missed. Evan was going home, at least in the technical sense. The house was still there, his adoptive parents still lived within it, and nothing had changed on paper. But somewhere deeper, there was always a quiet distance he could never fully cross. He had grown up in a stable, structured home, raised by a former military father who believed in order, routine, and control. Evan had followed that path without question. Yet even now, there were moments rare, uninvited, when something inside him felt unfinished, like a story missing its first chapter. The taxi driver broke the silence. A middle-aged man with a warm face, slightly graying hair, and the easy confidence of someone who enjoyed his own voice, he leaned forward just enough to catch Bruno's reflection in the mirror. "Nice dog. Belgian Malinois, right?" The dog tilted his head slightly, as if quietly reassessing the average intelligence of humanity for the night. Evan didn't look up immediately. "German Shepherd." The driver chuckled. Yeah, I knew that. Just testing you." A faint smirk touched Evan's lips. "You failed." The man laughed louder this time, unfazed. "He bite? Only when someone guesses wrong twice." That earned another laugh, though it came with a quick glance in the mirror. "He gonna, make a mess in my car?" "Bruno has better discipline than most people I've met." The driver nodded, impressed. "What's his name?" "Bruno." "What does he do?" Evan turned his gaze toward the passing streetlights. Gunpowder, explosives, blood, stress, and sometimes people who talk too much. The driver paused, then burst into laughter. Bruno tilted his head slightly, as if considering whether any of this was worth acknowledging, then settled again, his silence somehow more expressive than any reaction. A mile from home, Evan asked the driver to stop. He paid, stepped out, and let the night air meet him fully. The driver called out one last time. "Try not to save the world tonight, all right?" Evan gave a small nod. "That's the plan." He chose to walk the rest of the way, cutting through the edge of Balboa Park. It was something he did every time he came back, slow down before stepping into a life that never quite felt like his own. The path was quiet, lit by scattered lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. Bruno walked beside him, leash loose, moving with an ease that meant there was no threat. For a moment, they were just two beings sharing the night. Then Bruno stopped. Not a casual pause. His entire body stiffened, ears forward, muscles tightening beneath his coat. A low vibration formed in his chest, barely audible but unmistakable. Evan exhaled slowly. "Just a homeless person, Bruno." No response. "We're off duty. No missions, no saving anyone tonight." The leash pulled forward, just an inch, but firm. Evan shook his head, a quiet acceptance settling in. "We've done our part, paid our taxes. The rest is the system's problem." Another pull. He looked down at the dog, studying him for a few seconds. Bruno didn't move, didn't blink, just held that fixed focus into the darkness ahead. Evan sighed. All right, let's check it out. The alley sat just off the park's edge, narrow and dim, the smell of damp concrete and old metal lingering in the air. At the far end, a figure sat against the wall, curled inward as if trying to disappear into the shadows. As they approached, details began to form. A young woman, thin to the point of fragility. Her clothes hung loosely, worn and faded. Her arms wrapped around herself, not for comfort, but for survival. Her breathing came uneven, shallow, like each inhale had to be earned. Evan crouched a few feet away, careful not to startle her. Hey, can you hear me? Her head lifted slightly. Strands of dark, unkempt hair clung to her face. Her eyes clouded, unfocused, struggled to find him. Her lips parted, trembling, trying to form words that didn't quite come through. Maybe an apology? Maybe nothing at all. Then she collapsed. Evan caught her before she hit the ground, his movements immediate, precise. Fingers to her neck pulse weak, irregular, breath shallow, skin cold, too cold. His jaw tightened. Bruno, stay. The dog stepped back just enough, holding position, watching. Evan adjusted her carefully, supporting her head, running through the checks he had done countless times before. This wasn't combat, but the body didn't care about context. It only cared about survival. And right now, she wasn't winning. He didn't hesitate again, lifting her into his arms. He felt how light she was, wrongly light, like something had been taken from her over time, piece by piece. As he stepped out of the alley, the city lights stretched ahead of him, unchanged, indifferent. All right, Bruno, he muttered, voice low, steady. You got us into this. Now we finish it. Bruno moved beside him without a sound. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed faintly. Evan walked faster, and though he didn't know it yet, the night had already shifted. What lay in his arms wasn't just a stranger pulled from the edge of collapse. It was the first thread of a truth buried so deeply that even time had almost erased it. The hospital lights were too bright for that hour of the night, the kind that made everything feel sharper than it needed to be. Evan stood just outside the treatment room, hands still but not relaxed. He had done what he could on the street. Now it was out of his control, and that was always the part he trusted the least. A doctor stepped out, a woman in her late 30s, composed, her voice steady in the way of someone used to delivering difficult truths without hesitation. She's severely anemic, she said, glancing at a tablet. Long-term malnutrition, dehydration. This didn't happen overnight. Evan gave a small nod. He had already guessed that much. There's another issue, she continued. Her blood type is AB negative. We don't have enough in reserve. The words landed quietly, but they stayed. For a moment, Evan didn't speak. Something about the timing, the situation, it didn't sit right. The dog's reaction back in the alley, the way it had refused to move on, and now this. I'm AB negative, he said. The doctor looked up, surprised. Are you willing to donate? Evan didn't hesitate. Yes. There was no speech, no weight added to the decision, just a simple step forward, like it had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. Hours later, the hallway had grown quieter. Machines hummed behind closed doors. Footsteps came and went. The dog lay near the entrance, head low but eyes open, watching every movement like it mattered. Evan sat nearby, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. He had seen worse, far worse. But this felt different. Not heavier, not more urgent, just harder to place. The next day, the hospital called him back. No identification, no insurance, no emergency contact. Just a name, barely confirmed, and a situation that required someone to take responsibility. He handled the paperwork without complaint, signed where needed, covered the initial costs, and followed a nurse down the hall. Inside the room, the girl was awake. She looked better, if only slightly, enough to sit up, enough to focus. When she noticed him, there was a pause, uncertain, searching. You came back, she said, her voice still weak, but clearer. Evan pulled a chair closer. They needed information. She nodded slowly, as if that made sense. I'm Evan. Mila, she replied. Mila Harper. The name settled in the room. How are you feeling? Like I slept for a year and woke up in the wrong place. A faint attempt at humor, quickly fading. But better, thanks to you. Evan didn't respond to that directly. Do you have anyone I should call? She shook her head. No one left. A small pause. My adoptive parents passed a few years ago. After that, things didn't really hold together. She didn't say more, and somehow, she didn't have to. Evan leaned back slightly. You're my age. Mila gave a faint smile. 28. He exhaled through his nose. Same. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It just lingered longer than expected, like both of them were listening for something they couldn't quite hear. A nurse stepped in, already reaching for the chart as she spoke. All right, let me check on your sister for a moment. She paused mid-motion, eyes flicking between him and the woman on the bed. Mila blinked, a little confused, her gaze shifting briefly toward Evan as if trying to make sense of something she hadn't thought about until that second. A brief silence settled. Oh, sorry, the nurse corrected herself gently. I thought you were family. Evan shook his head. No, we just met. Mila let out a faint breath, still looking at him for a moment, longer than expected before lowering her eyes. From the next bed, an older woman with a soft, worn voice added, You still look alike, though. Something about the way you hold yourself. Neither of them answered that. The nurse moved on. The room returned to its quiet rhythm, but something had shifted. Evan didn't believe in coincidences, not the kind that stacked on top of each other like this. Across the room, the dog had moved closer at some point, settling near the side of the bed. Not restless, not alert, just there. When Mila lowered her hand slightly, it lifted its head and leaned into the touch without hesitation. She smiled, surprised. He trusts me. Evan watched that for a second longer than he meant to. He doesn't do that often. Maybe he knows something we don't, she said softly, half joking. Evan didn't laugh. That night, back at the house, the silence felt different. Familiar walls, familiar furniture, but none of it grounded him the way it used to. He found his father in the kitchen. I never asked you something, Evan said, leaning against the counter. When you adopted me, I was alone, right? The older man looked up slowly. There was a brief pause, just enough to register. What kind of question is that? Just answer it. A slight shift in tone. Not anger, not yet, but something close. You were alone, he said. We've talked about this. Evan held his gaze. No siblings? No. The answer came quickly. Clean. Your mother gave you up, we took you in, that's it. Too clean. Evan nodded once, as if accepting it. But something in him had already moved past the answer. Because sometimes the truth didn't feel wrong. It felt incomplete. Morning came without rest. Evan hadn't slept much. The house felt different after the conversation with his father, too quiet, too controlled, like something had been carefully kept in place for years. He moved through it without turning on many lights, grabbed his keys, and left before anyone asked questions he didn't feel like answering. The drive to the old care center took longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because of hesitation. He had never come back here, not once. Respect had been part of it, so had avoidance. Some doors stayed closed because opening them meant accepting whatever was on the other side. The building stood where it always had, unchanged in structure, but carrying a kind of stillness that didn't invite people in. Inside, the air felt older than it should. A receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes and a polite smile, looked up as he approached. I'm looking for adoption records, Evan said, from about 28 years ago. She hesitated just slightly, then nodded. I can check what we have. What they had wasn't much. Folders missing. Files partially scanned. Sections labeled but empty. A system that looked complete at first glance, until you followed it long enough to notice the gaps. I'm sorry, she said after a while, clearly uncomfortable. Some of the older records weren't properly transferred. A few were damaged. Others just never made it into the system. Evan just nodded. He knew this wasn't accidental. He had seen enough systems to know the difference between disorganized and deliberately incomplete. This didn't feel like an accident. Outside, he stood for a moment, staring at nothing in particular. Then he pulled out his phone. Noah Briggs picked up on the second ring. You don't call unless something's off, Noah said. His voice carried that dry edge of someone who had seen too many things to be surprised easily. "I need you to look into something," Evan replied. "Old adoption records, missing files." A pause on the other end. Then, quieter, more focused. "Send me everything you have." "I don't have much." "That's fine. If someone erased it, they didn't erase how they did it." That was enough. By late afternoon, Noah called back. "Listen, I'm going to say this straight," he said, voice lower than before. "You might not like it." A beat of silence. "I found something," he said. "Not a full record, more like a shadow of one." Evan didn't interrupt. "Same time frame as your adoption. There's a trace female infant. Same intake period. But the file's been split, reassigned, moved through a different channel. Different ID. No clear follow-up." Evan's grip tightened slightly on the phone. "You think it's connected?" "I think someone didn't want it to be." That was as close to confirmation as Noah ever gave. Evan didn't say anything for a few seconds. He didn't need to. The thought had already formed. He went back to the hospital that evening. Mila was sitting up when he walked in, a little more steady than before. The room felt quieter this time, like something was waiting to be said. "I went somewhere today," Evan said, pulling the chair closer. She looked at him, waiting. "The place I was adopted from." He kept his voice level. "Some of the records are missing. Not damaged, missing. Like they were taken out." Mila's fingers tightened slightly against the blanket. "There's something else," he continued. "I had a friend check what's left in the system. There's a trace of another file. Same time I was brought in. Same intake." She didn't blink this time, just stared at him. "A female record," Evan added, quieter now. "It doesn't lead anywhere. Like it was moved. Or hidden." A pause. "You think that was—" she began, but the words didn't come out fully. "I don't know," Evan said. Then, after a brief moment, "But if it is, it wouldn't be a coincidence that we met like this." The silence that followed felt different now. Not uncertain anymore, just heavier. "I want to find out for sure," he said. The room fell into a quiet that felt heavier than before. Not fear exactly, not hope either. Something in between. Mila nodded once. "What do we do?" Evan held her gaze. "We test it." The doctor arranged it quickly once he explained. Samples were taken, labeled, and sent out under priority processing. Results expected within 2 to 3 days. Waiting turned out to be harder than either of them expected. Time didn't pass evenly. It stretched in the wrong places. Conversations came in fragments, stopping and starting, as if both of them were holding something back without meaning to. Mila spoke about small things at first. Bits of memory, places she had stayed, jobs that didn't last. Then, slowly, she mentioned things she hadn't thought about in years, details her adoptive parents had told her when she was younger. Stories that never felt important until now. Evan listened. Sometimes he asked questions, sometimes he didn't. At night, he found himself replaying moments from his own childhood, not as memories, but as something to examine, looking for inconsistencies, looking for anything that didn't quite fit. Across the room, the dog stayed close to Mila more often than not restless, not protective in the usual sense, just present, as if proximity itself mattered. On the third day, the call came. They were both there when the doctor walked in with the results. She didn't sit down, didn't soften the delivery, just opened the file and spoke clearly. There is a direct biological match. The words landed, simple and exact. Mila didn't react immediately. Her eyes stayed on the doctor, like she needed to hear it again to understand it. "There's more," the doctor added. "The genetic markers indicate a very high probability of twin relation." That was when it shifted. Mila's breath broke first, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet fracture that turned into tears she didn't try to stop. Not out of shock alone, but something deeper. Something that had been missing without her ever having the words for it. Evan stayed still for a moment longer. Then he sat down, slower this time, like the weight had finally caught up to him. He looked at her again, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who had been missing from his life without him ever knowing it. And the thought settled in, heavy and sharp. While he had grown up with structure, stability, a place to belong, she had been out there, alone, learning how to survive one day at a time. Mila's eyes filled first. Not loud, not broken, just quiet tears that didn't ask for permission. Evan reached out without thinking. Their hands met halfway. He held on, not tightly, just enough to be certain she was real. Neither of them spoke. There was something like relief in the silence, and something else beneath it, something that hurt to accept. Because finding each other didn't erase what had been lost, it just made it impossible to ignore. They didn't have time to sit with it. The call came the next morning. Evan stepped out into the hallway to answer, the door closing softly behind him. Noah didn't waste words this time. "I found the name," he said. "It's not just missing records, it's someone." Evan leaned against the wall, listening. Dr. Nolan Pierce, developmental psychology, retired. Used to be tied to a research program that never officially existed. A brief pause. "You're not going to like where this leads." Evan's voice stayed level. "Send me what you have." An address followed. East of the city. Quiet area. Not much around. By the time Evan hung up, the direction had already settled in his mind. Back inside the room, Mila looked up, her eyes already searching his face for an answer. "I think I know who was behind it," he said. She held his gaze. "Then you're going." He nodded once. "And I'm coming with you." He didn't argue. Not this time. The drive out of San Diego felt longer than the map suggested. The city gave way to open stretches of dry land, the air changing, quieter, heavier. By the time they reached the address, the road had narrowed, houses spaced far apart, as if people out here preferred distance over neighbors. The house stood alone, worn but intact. Nothing about it stood out at first glance. That made it worse. Evan knocked once. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Footsteps, slow and uneven, approached from inside. The door opened just enough to reveal an older man, thin, unsettled, eyes that didn't quite focus the way they should. "Dr. Pierce?" Evan asked. The man hesitated. "Who's asking?" Evan didn't introduce himself. He held out a folder instead. "We need to talk." Something shifted in the man's expression when he saw the papers. Not recognition exactly, more like memory catching up with him. They stepped inside. The place wasn't messy. It was crowded. Boxes stacked along the walls, old tapes, notebooks filled with handwriting that tried too hard to stay precise. The air smelled faintly of paper and time. Mila stayed close, taking it in without speaking. Pierce moved toward a table, his hands restless. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered. "That work. It's over." "It's not," Evan said. "Not if it's still affecting people." The man let out a dry laugh. "You don't understand what it was." Evan set the folder down, opening it piece by piece. DNA results, fragments of records, reconstructed timelines. "I understand enough." Pierce looked at the documents. For a moment, he said nothing. Then came the denial. Quick, defensive, followed by explanations longer, scattered. Words like research, variables, controlled environments. He spoke as if repeating something he had told himself too many times. "It was an opportunity," he insisted. "A chance to observe how different conditions shape development. Nature versus environment. It could have changed everything." Evan didn't interrupt. That silence pressed harder than any argument. Pierce's voice lost its structure after a while. The justification thinned. What remained was something closer to truth. "They were brought in together," he said finally, quieter now. "Two infants, same day, same origin." Mila's hand tightened at her side. "The mother couldn't keep them," he continued. "The system would have processed them normally. But I intervened." Evan's jaw set, but he didn't move. "I separated them," Pierce admitted. "Placed them into different adoption paths. One into a stable environment, one into less predictable conditions." "For what?" Mila asked, her voice steady, even if the words weren't. Pierce looked at her, then away. "To see what would happen." The room went still. Evan stepped forward. Not fast, not threatening, just enough to close the distance. "You split a family," he said, his voice calm, controlled, "just to write it down somewhere." Pierce opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Evan's gaze didn't shift. "You watched two lives unfold and called it data." There was no anger in his tone. That made it land harder. Pierce sank into the chair behind him, whatever resistance he had left slipping away. I didn't think... No, Evan cut in quietly. You didn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It held everything that didn't need to be said. Mila didn't cry this time. She just stood there, absorbing it, piece by piece. Evan reached for his phone. This ends now, he said. The investigation didn't take long to reopen once the evidence was laid out. Files that had been buried started to surface. Patterns emerged. Not just one case. Not just them. Pierce didn't resist when they came for him. He looked smaller then. Not because anything about him had changed, but because the story he had built around himself no longer held. Outside, the air felt different. Mila stood beside Evan, arms crossed, not for warmth, but to hold herself steady. So that's it? She asked. Evan looked ahead. Not at the house, not at the past that had lived inside it. No, he said, that's just where it started. He turned slightly toward her. What happens next? We decide that. Evan didn't go back right away. The request for extended leave was short, direct. No explanation beyond what was necessary. His commander didn't ask for more. Some things you didn't need to spell out. For the first time, Evan stayed not because he had nowhere else to be, but because he finally knew where he was needed. The apartment wasn't big, just enough space for two people and the quiet that came with starting over. Clean walls, simple furniture, a kitchen that actually had food in it. Nothing extra, nothing wasted. Mila walked through it slowly the first day, not touching much at first, like she was afraid something might disappear if she got used to it too quickly. You don't have to earn this, Evan told her at one point, leaning against the doorway. She didn't answer right away, just nodded, like she understood the words, but not yet the meaning. That would take time. The dog adjusted faster. He moved through the apartment like he was mapping it, checking corners, settling near the door, shifting positions depending on where Mila went. When she sat, he stayed close. When she slept, he didn't move far. Every now and then, he let out a low breath, almost like a quiet complaint about the general lack of awareness in human beings. Mila noticed. Does he ever relax? Evan glanced over. This is him relaxed. That got a small laugh out of her, the kind that came easier each day. His parents took longer. The first time Evan told them, there was silence on the other end of the call, not disbelief. Something closer to being forced to reconsider a version of the past they had accepted without question. His father didn't say much at first, just listened, asked one or two questions, each one careful, measured. When they finally met Mila, it wasn't dramatic. No long speeches, no immediate warmth. Just a quiet evening, a table set for one more person than usual. She stood at the doorway for a second before stepping in. Not hesitant, exactly just aware that this was a place she had never imagined entering. Evan stayed close, not guiding, just there. His mother greeted her first, voice softer than usual. A simple welcome, nothing more. His father followed, clearing his throat like he needed a moment to get past something unspoken. He nodded once. Good to meet you. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Dinner started slowly. Small talk, questions that stayed on safe ground. Mila answered carefully at first, then a little more naturally as the conversation found its rhythm. At one point, his father reached for a glass, paused, then looked at her again. You like apple pie? He asked, almost casually. Mila blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, I think so. He gave a short nod, like that was enough to work with. Evan didn't say anything. He just watched it happen, something in his chest settling in a way it hadn't before. Under the table, the dog lay stretched out, positioned where he could see everyone at once. Still, quiet, like he had decided this moment needed supervision. Mila noticed him and smiled faintly, her foot brushing lightly against his side. He didn't move. The evening didn't change everything. It didn't erase what had been lost. But it shifted something, and sometimes that was enough to begin. Later that night, back at the apartment, the city felt different. Not quieter, not louder, just more grounded. Mila stood by the window for a moment, looking out, then turned back. This still doesn't feel real, she said. Evan leaned against the wall. It will. She studied him for a second. You're staying, aren't you? He didn't hesitate. Yeah. Not forever. Not yet. But long enough? She nodded. Like that answer mattered more than anything else right now. The dog shifted position near the door, settling in for the night. And for the first time in a long while, nothing felt like it was missing. Life doesn't always change with big moments. Sometimes, it shifts quietly through a step we almost didn't take, or a person we were never meant to lose. What happened to Evan and Mila may seem unlikely, but for many, it feels like something more, like God placing people back where they belong, even after years apart. If this story touched you, maybe take a moment today to reach out to someone you care about. A simple call, a short message, it matters more than we think. If you'd like to share where you're watching from or what part stayed with you, I'd love to hear it. And if stories like this bring you a little peace, you're always welcome to stay, listen, and come back for more. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and bring warmth to your home.